You're ready to go?
Great. Awesome. Thanks everyone for turning up for what is a very wet and windy afternoon in London. So my name, for those of you who don't know me, is Stephen. A very brief summary of my debate history, working from present backwards. I'll be CAing Euros in the coming year in Tallinn, along with Helena and 4 of our DCAs, including Olivia. Judging experience-wise, I've judged too many competitions. Most recently at Euros, had the privilege of judging the final there. Speaker-wise, I was runner-up at Worlds in Malaysia and second best speaker and semi-finalist at Zagreb Euros, and have broken top at competitions including Cambridge, English Mace, and other such competitions. So a long, possibly too long career, so hopefully I have some tips that can help you. So today's session is on impacting arguments, and within that I will also look at comparative arguments. I think it's best to treat them both in one session because explaining why your argument is comparatively more important than someone else's argument is a very good way of impacting your argument. So broadly, this session will be split into 7 parts. So firstly, I will just ask you guys very briefly what kind of things you're hoping to gain from the session, and hopefully the remaining 6 parts will cover that, and if it doesn't, then I will try and accommodate. Secondly, I'm going to talk to you about like the types of impacting that we can get. Broadly, I would say that they end up by and large being split into consequentialist and non-consequentialist lines. And then the 3rd and 4th parts will look at each of those independently. I'm not going to go into like huge amounts of detail in terms on those areas because, to be honest, they're separate talks about how to run then like non-consequentialist arguments or consequentialist arguments, but nonetheless enough to hopefully achieve the purpose of this workshop. Fifthly, I'll talk about how you can structure your arguments in a way which help you impact them. Sixthly, we'll talk about comparatives and metrics. And then 7th, some miscellaneous practical tips which don't really fit into the rest of the structure. So just a very quick disclaimer, mainly for those of you watching at home and subsequent. Any examples I use will just be for illustrative purposes, aren't like evidence of like personal views or anything I hold and things of that nature. So just wanted to clarify that. So great. So to begin, just to identify what are people hoping to achieve from this session? What are people struggling with maybe when it comes to impacting arguments or running comparative arguments?
It's how to impact principal arguments.
Okay.
Capture a principle reliant on the impacts.
Okay, great. That's the only thing we need to talk about in this session. Is not going to last very long. Is there anything else? Don't be shy.
Impacting arguments in terms of like why they're more important than everyone else's search.
Okay. All right, fine. Seems to have a very shy group. That's fine. We'll just go through it. If you have anything, yeah, please.
I'd like to hear your perspective on weighing impacts of arguments over principled arguments.
Okay.
So sometimes you need to practicalities in the debate, and people make the arguments out practical issues, weighing them above principled arguments, which generally proceed.
Okay, it's interesting you say that, because I would say that at least in Iona, like so the UK-based circuit, I would say it's swung the other way quite substantially, where consequentialist arguments are by and large treated with a lot more favour than principled arguments. I will almost certainly forget to answer that question. So when I'm ending section 4, which is impacting consequentialist arguments, if I haven't answered it, do you mind just flagging it again for me? Great, thank you. Okay, so let's move on to the second area. So I just want to talk about types of impact. So very quickly, my understanding of what we mean by impact, because to be honest, this word has really come into like the vocabulary a lot over maybe the past year, is essentially just another way of saying, why does this argument matter? Like, why should I care, to be blunt, about what you're saying? Yeah, and that's what we mean by impact. And I would say the kinds of impact we can get are broadly split into 3 areas. The first is impacts along principles / like norms. So this is going to impact a principle or a norm of some kind. The second is rights and like non-consequentialist type principles. And the third are just consequences, right? And I would say that broadly speaking, most impacts will fall within one of those 3 criteria, three areas. I would then say actually that a lot of people, I think, fail to notice that the principles and norms actually falls into one of the other 2. So what I mean by that is if you're making an argument that this, for example, is going to change how people, interact with one another, i.e. that changes that norm, that's going to fall, actually, that's just a consequence that you're talking about there. Those arguments aren't in any real way like distinguishable. So I'll be talking about that within the consequences section. So let's start by talking about non-consequentialist arguments. This is the 3rd section. I want to illustrate this by using like a pyramid. So I will, by the way, put together a note on this, so don't worry about like tracking everything. But imagine there's a pyramid which has 4 sections. The most important thing and the first thing you should do when trying to impact a consequentialist argument, a non-consequentialist argument, is to explain, for example, why that thing you're talking about is a right. Okay? That's the first thing you need to do. The thing above that, I'll go into detail about each of these things in a minute. The next section after that is, why is it wrong to infringe that right? The one above that is why that right is being infringed in the context of whichever debate you're talking about. And then the top of the pyramid is just comparative. So like comparing that against other things. And this is where the question that I was asked is dealt with. So let's start from the bottom. So the first thing I want to say is just looking at that pyramid as a whole, I hope it makes intuitive sense to see why, first of all, you have 4 layers. And that's one thing I want to flag immediately, which is I think if you look at it on that piece of paper, I think most people will look at it and go, yeah, that makes sense. There's nothing hugely controversial there. There's not something there that shouldn't be there, or it should be in a different order. But the difficulty is remembering that when you're actually making that argument. So that's in prep, when you're writing your notes, but also when you're delivering it. Because from a judge point of view and also from a speaker point of view, very aware that what happens is at least one of these sections is not done at all or not done very well, and then the whole argument can fall away. So let's begin with talking about why it's a right. And like I said at the start, this session is not exclusively on justifying, I'm talking about how to justify rights or deontological criticism. There are some notes and stuff I can more than happy to send around on that. But in a nutshell, what you want to be doing here is you want to be appealing to people's intuitions, because it's very difficult, and I would go as far as saying impossible, and lots of philosophers have tried, and to prove these things beyond all doubt, but you can't, right? Because lots of other philosophers will disagree. So what you're trying to do in a speech is appeal to people to make them believe that that thing you're talking about is a right? So that involves, first of all, giving some kind of definition of what a right is. So like by and large, something inalienable, which we have by nature of being human beings, which we don't earn, which we can't trade away, which other people can't take away from us, right? So to pick a right which most people think is uncontroversial is I have a right not to be killed, providing I'm not harming someone else. Yeah, so by and large, most people would agree with that. So then you would look to, if you were trying to justify that right to someone, you would look to try and see how can I best convince someone that that's something that is a right, rather than something which actually is just something that we can trade along any other lines. And that's where I say we need to try to appeal to one's intuition, because this is where drawing, like pointing out examples, explaining how, you know, it's something which we value, and explaining why we value that. So in this context, for example, the reason we say that, you know, people don't have that right is because one necessarily needs to be alive in order to achieve and experience anything else in life that's positive or negative, right? If you're not alive, you can't do those things. And you then take on the next step and say, look, if one individual is not harming someone else, given how important being alive is, because it's the only way of experiencing pleasures and pains that come with being alive, why is it that someone else should be able to take that away from you? And, you know, like I said, there's a lot more you can say that, but nonetheless, that's the aim, you know, that's the path you're going through. But you have to fundamentally explain that to begin with, even before you can end up impacting this argument at the end, right? So that's your first stage. The next stage then will follow from that. And again, this is where there'll be some overlap in terms of what a right is, because you'll be explaining why it's wrong to infringe that. Yeah. So once you've established that you have a right to something, so for example, say the motion is this house believes it's legitimate to target civilians in war, and you say, no, look, people have a right not to be used as a means to an end, because they're an end in and of themselves, right? And you may attempt to justify that by saying each one of us has very unique experiences, and our happiness or unhappiness can't be aggregated against someone else's, right? You know, you can't say, all right, we can harm Steve because he'll suffer -10, but all the rest of you will suffer +1, will benefit +1, because if we add up all the +1s, it's more than the -10. And the reason you can't do that is because my happiness and your happiness, or my unhappiness and your unhappiness, are two very distinct things. It's not the same thing experiencing that, we're two individuals experiencing that, right? And then you can go on to say things along the lines of, on top of that, then, we are individuals who have our own hopes and dreams and aspirations, right? And our own desires to, you know, to feel love, happiness, and, you know, see our family, our friends, etc., etc. It's not good enough to say to one person that, you know, sorry, but we're going to sacrifice those individual benefits to you to save someone else, right? And we'll talk about this later. We'll talk about structuring arguments. This is where, for example, it helps to split out your justifications in a way I didn't do just then, because I merged like two separate ones together. But nonetheless, we're proving why it's right, but then based on that, why it's wrong to infringe that. So then you would go on and say, look, given we are individuals, given we are ends in and of ourselves and not instruments, right, in a way that you can, I'll use this pen to write something, that's very different to using a human, because that human themselves is valuable, right? They have their own happiness, their own experiences. You can't just use them for some other purpose. And therefore, when the when the Gov say in this case that they want to kill X person to benefit the rest, that's just not good enough, because that person in and of themselves is valuable, etc., right? So what you're doing there is you're drawing that link between why it is that it's a right and why it's wrong to infringe that right. And usually that's not a very hard link to form, because by and large, when you convince someone that something's a right, they're usually quite willing to believe it shouldn't be infringed. The only point I'd note here is, a lot of times in debates, you end up with situations where you have clashing rights, you know? So like, someone will convince you that people have a right to live in a state where they have access to, you know, basic education and health care and sanitation, etc. And then the other side will say, we believe you have a right not to be killed. But then one side will be saying, well, if we kill like 5 people, then we'll give all of these other people all these other benefits, which are also rights. And then you have to weigh them up against each other. And we'll talk about that in the comparative bit at the top of the pyramid. The next bit is, again, something which will be hopefully quite easy to do, but just don't forget to do it, which is to very clearly explain why the other team are infringing on this right. because sometimes as a judge, it's frustrating where a team has explained to you that something is a right, they've explained to you why it'd be wrong to infringe that right, but it's actually unclear if that right is being infringed or if it's just being, it's not even being interacted with or something of that nature. So very clearly explain then why in this motion necessarily involves harming that person's right. Yeah. So an example I think which better illustrates this particular point is debates about people's privacy. One side will say privacy is important. The other side will attempt usually to say, but your privacy is not being infringed because privacy is important. Privacy is infringed when you know it's being infringed. So for example, if spied on like the American public, until they knew they were being spied on, they didn't suffer any harm because they didn't know about it, and therefore they didn't feel their privacy was being infringed, and therefore they went about their lives in any way that they would have done previously, right? Do you see then how justifying on the other side that privacy is really important and it'd be wrong to infringe it would still not beat that argument unless you explain why it was being infringed there, right? So you need to give some kind of justification about why it is that privacy isn't dependent on you like knowing that it's being infringed for it to be harmful, right? You need to provide that kind of justification. And the final thing is then weighing this up against other rights or consequences, right? So we'll discuss a little bit later about in comparatives the different kind of metrics we can use, but in particular when it comes to non-consequentialist arguments, you just need to be very strong when you say, look, if we've shown you X person has Y right and the op are infringing on it. We don't care about what your consequences are. That's illegitimate because we've explained to you why that right is wrong for that right to be infringed. What you should also be doing, though, in any scenario where you do run non-consequentialist arguments, is attack consequentialism, right? Independently, in a separate argument. So to give reasons why consequentialism is the wrong metric by which we should make moral decisions. So off the top of my head, you may say things like, it doesn't distinguish between individuals. We can't possibly agree to use a system which has such absurd conclusions as like if you had one person who just gets so much happiness from like torturing everyone else that which would outweigh the torture of all those individuals. Pure consequentialism would say, yeah, that's fine. And that's where you'd be appealing to people's intuitions, right? Be like, hold on a minute, like this is the logical conclusion of that system that the op are putting forward. That's wrong, right? Here's a more sensible approach. But you should be doing that in addition. But when it comes to then actually just weighing it up directly, you have a couple of options to you. So the first thing is explain when you're talking about rights being against other rights, the certainty of rights being infringed. What I mean by this is, usually when teams are talking about different rights being infringed, it's very rarely going to be the case that the chance of those rights being infringed is the same. So I'm trying to think of an example that best illustrates this. But let's take the example of privacy. If someone's spying on the public and you've shown that in general, that regardless of whether you know about it or not, is a right infringement of your right to privacy, that definitely happens, right? If they're spying, that definitionally means they're infringing that right to privacy. But the other side will be arguing that they're doing it in order to achieve some benefit, right? Usually like national security. But that's not guaranteed. You can spy on 100 million people, but the vast majority of those people aren't doing anything remotely wrong. And therefore, and even if you spy on all of them, and some of them are doing something wrong, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be achieving some goal at the end of it. But the point I'm illustrating there then is you can argue on the side if you're defending privacy, this person and all of these other people who are being spied on, their rights are unquestionably and undeniably infringed by this policy. and all the other side can tell us in response is there's a chance that it might protect some people's rights, and that's why we're doing it. That's not good enough, right? And that's automatically one way of you trying to show why your rights matter more than the other team's rights in a particular context. Another one is, and sticking to the pyramid theme, is there's usually a hierarchy of rights. You know, like you don't need to necessarily like read like a political text or philosophical text to realize that, but you can argue one way or another usually that one right is more important than the other right. So for example, you can argue that privacy is more important than national security, given that it affects individuals absolutely, and it can affect every single part of their day-to-day life, because if they change how they interact with people and they start mistrusting like their neighbors or mistrusting the government, that can influence them in literally every interaction they have in life. So whilst none of those interactions will be like substantially different, maybe if you add up the total effect of all of those differences, it has a very big difference in someone's life. You can give examples to illustrate that. But equally on the other side, you can say, no, national security is more important, because the worst that the other side can tell us is that you might start acting differently. There'll be some chilling effect, right? You know, you might not be Googling what you previously Googled, or you might not speak to the people in your neighborhood as like openly as you did before. But that's far less important than saving people's lives from like horrific like terrorist attacks and things. And that's why that's more important. So do you see how you're essentially arguing for a hierarchy of rights? And the key thing to emphasize here is you can nearly always argue either way. And if you're the team in the room that's making efforts to provide these arguments, honestly, you're usually going to be the only team in the room who's doing that. And therefore, when it comes to judging, it becomes a lot easier for a judge to go, all right, these arguments say, well, like both well explained. And it's quite difficult to work out which team explained their argument better than the other. But there's this one team that really makes an effort to explain why theirs is comparatively more important, and provides us with like a metric, a way of identifying that theirs is more important than the others, which goes beyond simply just stating what their arguments are, and that will help you. So to move on to the fourth section, which is about consequences. This pyramid, I would say, only has 3 sections. The one at the bottom is why your benefit or harm will occur. The one above that is why that is good or bad. And then again, it's comparative at the top of the pyramid. So we just take a step back and just think about this in the context of how a debate round and arguments often play out. Is imagine the motion is one which leads the team to argue there's going to be a backlash, right? And backlash is quite a popular argument in lots of debates, and very, very validly so. If it's run well, it's very effective. So, motion is this house would implement X policy, and opening up, say there's a backlash. Backlash, whilst a very commonly run argument, is by and large a very poorly run argument, because teams will usually do one, but very rarely both of the following things. They'll either convince the judges, that the backlash will occur, but then not really talk about why that would be so harmful. Or they don't really convince the judges that the backlash will occur, but explain in good detail why if it did occur, it'd be really bad. If the judges are judging that debate accurately, I'm afraid neither of those teams is going to do it, neither of those conceptions is going to do very well, because you need both of them in order for that argument to be valid, right? Because if you think about it, if you convince the judges that there's going to be a backlash, but you don't explain it's bad, the judges should turn around and say to you, we definitely believe you that it's going to be a backlash, but just don't really care, because we don't see why it'd be such a harmful thing. And then equally, if you convince them that it'd be terrible, but it's unlikely, it's not hugely different to explaining, you know, like if you explain in great detail why the world is going to end, but then you don't explain why the world's going to end, then you're not going to get any credit for that, right? So please be aware of that, because that genuinely is an error like I see like all the time. And it's not just with backlash arguments. I'm just using that as an illustration. But if you think to pretty much every argument you make will follow that structure and its consequences. Why would that happen? Why is it bad? But you need to respect both of those pillars. And then of course, the comparative pillar, which we'll talk about. So when we talk about why something will occur, what I would say, and this is one of the practical tips that I would recommend, I would split these pillars into separate arguments, because when speakers try and merge them together, this is where it becomes more difficult, for them or their partner to identify that they're not proving something very well. What I mean by this is, if you imagine you have on one piece of paper at the top why there will be backlash, yeah? Between you and your partner, you are definitely going to make sure that you put down arguments that prove why there's going to be backlash, yeah? And then if you have a separate piece of paper then that has at the top why backlash, like why the backlash will be harmful, again, you and your partner will ensure that you put arguments down to explain why it would be harmful. What will often happen is people put this on one piece of paper, right? And then it just becomes a lot harder to identify yourself, but also for your teammate. Because, for example, I usually speak second, and I usually will look at my partner's notes, right? Because they're speaking first, to see what they're intending on saying, and if they're saying what we discussed. And you know, it then becomes very easy if we're doing the two separate papers, for me in this case, or the second speaker or whatever, to kind of go, we've not really explaining why this would be bad, and then I can, you know, help fill that in. But if it's all merged together, it becomes very difficult, right? So as a practical tip, that can genuinely make a huge difference. So I'd recommend that. Please feel free to use recyclable paper and stuff, but like it's worth it's definitely worth the additional sheets. So I'll discuss now what kinds of ways we can explain that something is good or bad as well, right? Because what I mean by this is often teams will do the hard work of explaining why something will happen, but then just not do the easy point, which I call kind of like it's where the points are, right? So to pick another example, if you're running an argument that explains that people are going to get poorer, right, which will happen in, you know, you'll, like, one side will argue that in a lot of social policy debates, that argument is only useful insofar as you explain why it's difficult, why it's bad if someone becomes poorer or a group of people becomes poorer. And that seems harsh because it seems intuitive, but again, if it's judged accurately, you shouldn't really be given very much credit, even if they're like convinced that people get poorer, because there's degrees of what impact that can have, and also you really want to illustrate the harms. In this particular instance, that's not going to be very difficult for you, right? Because it's very intuitive why that's the case, and you're just going to be going through relatively quickly by just explaining those kinds of things. In other scenarios, it might be more difficult. So in terms of backlash, if your backlash is one which, you know, involves like a relatively small group of people, you're going to have to do a reasonable amount of work to explain why that's damaging, because people might say, we don't really mind if, you know, a couple of thousand people get angry about something, because there are ways for us to deal with that. So another thing to flag at this point is the amount of time you need to spend on each of these sections will vary based on the argument. And if you just take a little moment to think about it when you're in prep or whatever, you will realize yourselves how much time you should spend, right? Because if you're kind of like, this is going to be a tough sell, you're going to have to spend more time on it. If it's not, then you're not going to spend as much time on it, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't make sure you get the points out on that particular section. And again, comparative at the top, which we'll talk about separately in a second. So I'm just going to pause briefly to see, does anyone have any questions on what I've covered thus far? Yeah.
What kind of metrics would you use for explaining damage stuff?
So I'll talk about that in comparatives, yeah. No? Okay, great. So the fifth thing I want to talk about is just about how we can structure our arguments in a way to maximize impact. So I've kind of covered part of this already in terms of like talking about splitting them into different pieces of paper. But I think most people are familiar with the idea that arguments generally are like have three layers, which is like why it's true, why it's relevant, and comparative. But I actually think the two pyramids we've discussed already, I think is a more helpful way of thinking about how arguments are structured, because they do differ based on what kind of argument you're making. But what I want to emphasize is two things. So the first thing is, as I said earlier, actually I haven't said this earlier, the first thing I would say is there are subcomponents to arguments. What I mean by that is breaking down an argument into different things you're trying to prove, right? So we just did with, say, the backlash, right? Many people get up and say backlash is first argument or something, but actually treat that as different subcomponents. Like I said, why there'll be a backlash, why it'd be bad, why that backlash is worse than whatever else that the other side are talking about. Yeah, and then treat those as three distinct things you're going to talk about, because it makes it very clear for the judge, it makes it very clear for yourselves. The second thing is you will often have more than one reason for those subcomponents. And that's another reason why breaking them down is helpful, because a lot of speakers, get frustrated with judges, and a lot of the time it's legit. But other times they get frustrated because they're like, well, I said that, I definitely said that. And they probably did. But when you're merging different reasons which apply to different sub-elements of arguments into one big argument, it can be very difficult to follow. And therefore you won't get the credit that you should, that the material you're talking about deserves. So please be aware of that when you're actually making your arguments. Great. Now moving on to the sixth thing, which is comparatives and metrics. So what I thought might be helpful here is, first of all, to start by just explaining what I mean by those terms, and then giving like 7 or so different ways which will frequently be useful for you to weigh up things, so criteria. I hope that'll answer the question as well. So what we mean by comparatives is the following. It actually is helpful to start by talking about the difference between a comparative and rebuttal. So one team will make an argument, and usually what we mean by rebuttal is attacking that argument to explain that it's not true, or it's not as true or damaging as you say it is. Yeah, is what we mean. So you directly attack it. But comparatives are essentially, I would describe as saying, all right, let's assume that our argument is true. Why is it that this particular argument we're talking about is still more important than that argument they're talking about? Yeah. So the optimum strategy is to rebut an argument as much as you can, and then still after that give a comparative justification for why what you're talking about is more important than what they're talking about, because you're building up layers of defense and, to be honest, in this case, attack as well, right? Because you're not just relying on knocking down their argument, you're kind of going, CA team, you have set a motion which has arguments on both sides. Well done. Here is why our arguments in this particular round are more important than our arguments. And that's what you're doing. Yeah? And it seems very simple, but unfortunately, I completely understand how it can happen. I'm very guilty of it myself a lot of the time. When you're in the midst of a round, you kind of want to make arguments and you want to rebut. Comparatives can kind of fall by the wayside a little bit. Yeah? Metric is just the criteria by which you're making that comparative, and that's what we're going to talk about in a second. And what I mean by criteria is just like, on what grounds are you trying to prove to the judges that your arguments are more important comparatively than someone else's arguments? Does that make sense? Great. And so again, I just want to flag, it can be very helpful to treat the comparative section again as a distinct sub-component, as a separate, again, like separate piece of paper. Or because essentially I'm just using separate piece of paper, as you can probably tell, also as like a simpler way of just like making sure your mind looks at these things differently. because you may have 2 or 3 reasons why this is comparatively more important than something else, and it's useful to separate those things. So 7i, I think, come up quite a lot. The first is the number of people your argument affects. So to take an example, motion about legalizing all drugs. One side says, okay, this is really beneficial because people who currently take drugs can now take them in a safer way. And then the other side would say, okay, but now more people who currently don't take drugs and are harmed. Yeah? A useful way of weighing up one of those arguments against the other would be trying to convince the judges that the group of people you're talking about is larger than the other sides. Yeah? Again, do you see how you can't just assert that? You would have to provide arguments. Why is it that there are more people who are now going to take drugs and be harmed than who currently take drugs who can now take them in a safer way? Why is that going to be more? And vice versa. Those require actual arguments to justify. But if you do, brilliant, because even if the judges believe that the other side's argument is true on some level, you'll still be winning out. Yeah. The second one is the intensity of the benefit or harm. Okay, and this is a very useful way, for example, of winning a comparative when your comparative doesn't affect the greatest number of people. Because again, I would say by and large, judges, where all other things being equal, will generally lean towards an argument which affects more people. Yeah, so it can be very helpful to kind of just say, look, it's not just about how many people are affected, but rather how they're affected. Yeah, so you know that example we talked about earlier in the case of, say, if you torture one individual, and well, it's like terrible for them, right? But if everyone else in the room like gets some enjoyment out of it, even if that's affected more people, the intensity of the harm on the person being tortured is probably quite easy to convince people that is something we should care more about. Yeah, but equally, there'll be other circumstances where you want to argue it the other way. The third thing is whether or not we owe any special duties to any of these people or actors. So, you know, one side of the motion, sorry, one bench may argue, okay, this motion benefits group X, which outweighs the harm done to group Y. And that might actually be true. But then if you can show that we owe a special duty to group Y, you can convince people that actually doesn't matter that they're harmed less than the benefit, even if teams have argued that successfully. The fourth one is one I use like all the time, and it's one we've discussed already, which is likelihood of whatever thing you're talking about happening. So we talked about it in the case of privacy, about how someone's definitely being the right to being infringed versus potential chance of benefit. And what you can do is, again, a very effective technique is combine likelihood with potential impact. So almost in like a, you know, likelihood of something happening, multiply it by the harm or benefit, and you have like a figure, right? The reason I say that is, for example, an argument I've had a lot of success with is where you explain that there's a potential harm that could occur, and you know the other side might be able to convince the judges that the chance of that harm occurring is pretty slim, yeah. But then you say, look, if it did occur, we'd be screwed, right? Like we'd just be done. And even if there's a minuscule chance, the risk of that outweighs the benefits that they're going to talk about, which are more likely to happen. And then you explain why that's the case. You know, you'd be justifying being risk averse there. You can see hopefully how you can argue the opposite, right? You can go up on the other side and go, you know, Stephen gets up and says that we shouldn't have AI because they may turn on us, right? and then we'd all be dead. Fine, like someone's been watching too much Terminator, right? Yes, theoretically that could happen, but here are ways we can prevent that happening or like reduce the chances to the point where the chance of that happening is very, very slim. Okay? On our side of the house, if we had AI, here are all the benefits which we'd have almost immediately, right? Which have a near certainty of accruing. And look at the benefits that has to each of these groups of people. Yes, there's a chance it can go horribly wrong, but that's true in like nearly everything we do, right? Like whenever we develop a drug, there's only so much we know about what its side effects are going to be, but it doesn't mean we don't, you know, put them out after having some testing, etc. So you can see how you can flip it either side, right? And that can be very effective. The fifth thing is, for example, whether or not someone or whatever actor is has consented to something. So it might be a scenario where the harm to one group again, which might be a small group, it might be a group we don't owe any special duties to, and the harm might be slim compared to benefits to a large group of people, etc., etc. But if you can say, hold on a minute, that group of people have not consented to this in a way that actually the other group have consented to not achieving those benefits for whatever reason, and that's why we need to prioritize them. Again, that's a way of explaining why your group matters more than the other. Yeah, it's quite hard to flip that particular one the other way around. It's not very easy to explain that someone not consenting is a good reason to like to like screw them over. But that's one of the anomalies on this list in terms of being able to use them on both sides. And the final one that like I'd say is used quite frequently is viability of alternatives to achieve the same outcome. And what I mean by that is, if you can say, look, our argument achieves the following, and this policy is unique in able to achieving that, right? It provides those things in a way others can't. The harms they talk about on their side are going to exist anyway, right? For this way, regardless of whether we do this or that, they're going to occur. So we need to prioritize what we're doing here. It works even stronger the other way, which is, yes, God get up and say there's this benefit, but we've given you two counter proposals and explained to you why those would also achieve those benefits without the harms we're talking about here, and that's why our harms should be prioritized over the benefits you're talking about. As a general tip, strategically, I would say, is the most effective, like when there's a lot of these will apply in many debates, right? So in terms of working out which ones to use, first and foremost, if you can use the same criteria the team on the other side has used and use it better than them, use that, right? So for example, if opening guards get up and go, look, we want to save the greatest number of lives, that's the criteria that they've set out for the debate. If you can explain that your harms, the consequences on your side lead to more people dying than their side, then on their own metric, they're losing the debate. Yeah, that's very powerful. But if you can't do that, then essentially just think about, all right, which one of these or which two of these metrics are most effective for us. You don't want to kind of spend too much time putting down like 4 or 5. To be honest, like 1 or 2 is plenty for each argument, because if you think about it, the reason it's at the top is a very strong comparative is useless if you've not explained why your thing is going to happen, why it's bad, or in the case of the right, it's the other 3 stages. Yeah, like it does, because you're relying on proving those things in order to show it's more important than the others. It's a prerequisite to get to that stage. So in terms of allocation of time, it has to come at the bottom. Right. And the final thing I want to talk about is just some miscellaneous practical tips. And I think I've covered one of these already, which is the top one, which is note-taking. Like I've said already, like where possible, please try and use a page for each of the subcomponents that we talked about, because it will help you and your partner. The second thing is, in prep, and this is also during the round, especially if you're bottom half, but also if you're top half, push each other on these questions, right? So push each other on, like thinking, all right, are we actually impacting this? Because people often get tunnel vision in rounds, you know, and spend a lot of time talking about something is going to happen, and not explain why it's bad, or vice versa. And don't just rely on the second speaker to be able to do that. Like, both of you should do it. And also, as a general tip, as a first speaker, when you sit down, the temptation is just to go down. Yeah, your partner is probably bricking themselves and trying to like make up for you messing up. So do your best to help them. So, for example, be critical of your own speech. Think about, all right, what didn't I show that I should have done? Did I show what was going to happen? Did I show why it mattered? Maybe not actually. And then tell your partner at a suitable time. And the third and final thing I would say is when you're then looking to, so imagine, you know, you're in the next, you know, this practice debate, say, hopefully you'll be able to implement some of this stuff, right? So then when it comes to how best to attack a side, which does these things properly, always try and attack it from the base up, right? And that's why we're talking about this pyramid. If you take out the bottom, the whole thing collapses. If you take out the comparative, they can still win. The judge can still think, no, I still think they explained that better, yeah? So if you think about it, it's very helpful when you're in a round to identify where the weak point of a case is. A team might have explained beautifully to you the harms of something occurring, and you can get up and almost acknowledge that, yeah? But then if you acknowledge that they haven't shown why something's going to occur, and then explain why it won't occur, and in fact something else on your side will occur instead, it'll be far easier to knock that argument down than spending like a lot of time explaining why their benefits aren't true. Are there any questions? Brad?
Cool. Thanks, Stephen. Woo!